everyone, my name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going to be looking at a pretty interesting model for thinking about consent. Just so you know, if you're not familiar with my work, I am primarily a BDSM educator, and so this video will contain references to kink and BDSM if that happens to make you uncomfortable. However, I think thinking about consent is by no means exclusive to kink or BDSM, and so hopefully, even if you're not into those things, some of what I am talking about here will resonate with you and will be helpful to know about. I actually want to start here because eventually what I want to do is have a more BDSM-centric video where I talk about some of the ethical frameworks that are available to us. You might have heard of SSE, or safe, sane, and consensual, RAC, PRIC, etc. All of them contain one very important letter, which is C, that stands for consent. And you probably know that consent generally refers to permission for something to happen, or an agreement that something happening is okay. However, actually obtaining consent and what good consent practices look like is a very nuanced conversation, and I think it's one we've been having more and more over the last couple of years. And so before I dive into those models which take consent as a given, I first want to think about consent in more specificity. And the term we're going to be using to do that today is known as the Fries model, which was actually developed by Planned Parenthood about 4 years ago, I want to say, or at least that is when I first came across it on Tumblr. And I think this is a really useful term because prior to having this, we really had a lot of sort of individual terms that were competing with each other for talking about what good consent looked like, things like enthusiastic consent, informed consent, so on and so forth. And what the Fries model does is it takes all of those various competing terms and synthesizes them under one more concise label. And as you've probably guessed, the Fries model is actually an acronym. It stands for freely given, revocable or reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And what I want to do here is break down each one of these terms more precisely, have a discussion about what they mean, as well as some things you would want to keep in mind when using this model, in particular with kink and BDSM related situations. So let's go ahead and start talking about the first part of the acronym, which is freely given. Freely given means consent that is voluntary. It is something that is done without manipulation or pressure or threats or coercion. It's something that you give freely. And as far as the Planned Parenthood definition goes, it also says that it should be free of influence from drugs and alcohol. Now, if you are one of my viewers who's from overseas, if you're from Europe or the UK, you probably know where this is going because I have talked about drugs and alcohol and BDSM on my channel before. And especially if you're not from America, your relationship to drugs and alcohol and sex and BDSM is pretty different. Around here, it's generally unusual to have BDSM be done under the influence of, say, alcohol. Whereas in the UK or elsewhere in Europe, it's pretty common to have that done. And so I think it's important to be aware of cultural norms while also seeking to have better models of consent. And what I think is important to consider here is when that influencing substance comes into play. I think it's very different to have a scenario where you're already super drunk at a bar and you meet a stranger and you decide to do something that night and you black out because you're so drunk, and that's just a recipe for a really, really bad situation. Versus having a play partner that you already trust, that you've done this thing with multiple times before, that you negotiate with in advance, and then add in the intoxicating substance as the play is happening, as opposed to negotiating while already under the influence with somebody you don't already know. We have to remember that the Fries model is a best practice model. That means it is showing you this is the best way to have consent be done. However, it is not the only way to have consent be done. And especially when you do have that trust level built up, when it is something where you are risk informed and you are willing to take on the additional risk that comes with playing under the influence, you can choose to make that decision. And I just want to call it out here because it is something that will come up when we talk about things like safe, sane, and consensual, rack, and prick in later videos. So let's go ahead and talk about the second part of the acronym, which is revocable or reversible. What this means is that anybody should be able to withdraw their consent at any time. Even when you are in the middle of sex or in the middle of a scene, you should be able to stop what is happening. You should be able to withdraw your consent. And as far as kink and BDSM goes, I think this is the most important one to think about when it comes to separating kink from abuse. With abuse, you can't revoke your consent. Nothing you do, nothing you say will get the abuse to stop. Whereas in kink, you should be able to revoke your consent at any time and have the behaviors or the activities stop immediately. And it's also worth noting here that the revocability goes both ways. It's not just for subs or bottoms to revoke their consent, but tops and doms as well. So let's go ahead and move on to the third part of the acronym, which is also really important for BDSM, which is informed. Informed consent is about knowing the full story of what's happening. If somebody says, yes, I'm on birth control, or yes, I will use a condom, and then they don't use a condom, or they're not on birth control, then that is not informed consent because that's not the full story. They didn't do what they were expected to do based on what they said was going to happen. That's not what full consent looks like. And what is interesting with kink here is I think when we talk about informed consent, we are usually referring to not just merely knowing exactly what's going to happen during a scene, but rather being accurately aware of what the risks are of the things that we are doing. You know, what is the risk of a flogging? What is the risk of letting somebody's blood or drinking blood, right? Knowing these things ahead of time allow you to give informed consent. So maybe a parallel here with kink would be if somebody says, oh, don't worry about blood play, it's not really that bad, you don't have anything to worry about, without telling you what the risks are of infection or bloodborne pathogens being spread. That's not really informed consent because they didn't actually give you all the information that you needed in order to assess whether or not you could consent to the thing that was going on. However, there is definitely a debate about who is responsible for making sure that the consent is informed. Is it on the party that is going to be receiving that experience to be aware of what's going to happen to their own bodies? Is it on the person proposing the play activities? Is it on the person who's going to be doing the behaviors to someone else? And it is something that's worth discussing, especially if you are negotiating with somebody to do kink. It's worth saying, hey, you know, when it comes to informed consent, what is your general behavior? Do you inform your play partners? Does it depend on if they are new or not? Am I expected to assess the risk for myself? So on and so forth. Important conversations to have and definitely a level of nuance to consider. Number 4 on this list is enthusiastic. And this is the one that I probably have the strongest, most controversial opinion about. When most people talk about enthusiastic consent, they define it in language like it's saying hell yes to whatever you're doing. It's your body saying yes to everything that's going on. And I'm an asexual person, and so me being enthusiastic about sexual activities is generally not something that's going to happen very often. But that doesn't mean I can't consent to having sex or doing other intimate behaviors with my partners. At least as Planned Parenthood defines it, they define enthusiastic more as being something that you want to do versus something that you feel pressured or obligated to do. And so I think it makes more sense to focus on it as behaviors that you want to engage in versus things that you feel pressured to do rather than always being a hell yes. Because honestly, even if you're not asexual, I think requiring that everything always be something that you're actively hell yes about is seriously over optimistic of how much everybody always wants to have sex, because partners have different needs, different sex drive levels, and compromise, I think, is part of having an intimate relationship. Looking at it from a more kink-focused perspective, you might be somebody that has a partner with a foot fetish. and maybe you're not really into foot stuff yourself, but you're willing to give your partner a foot job every once in a while because it makes them happy, because it's important to your relationship, and it's something that you're not like actively know about, even if it's not really your favorite thing ever. And so I think we should leave room for compromise, for doing things that our partners enjoy that we don't necessarily hate, and just allowing there to be a little bit of a gray area between absolutely no and actively hell yes. Especially if you're doing power exchange. You probably already know this, but oftentimes the most powerful parts of a power exchange relationship is when you do things purely for your partner's sake versus things that are inherently fulfilling for you. It's not necessarily that you hate the activity that you're doing. It's kind of a meh, kind of a neutral, not my favorite thing ever. And the part of it that kind of fulfills your spirit is the fact that it's an act of devotion. It's an act of service for your partner in some way because you enjoy suffering for them. And so there is a level of enjoyment, there is a level of I want this. It just looks very different from maybe the stereotypical vanilla, hell yes, please put a penis in my vagina type consent. So there is nuance there, and I could probably make a whole video where I just break down enthusiastic consent in more detail, but I'll go ahead and put a pin in that one for now because it is time to talk about the last part of the model, which is specific. Basically what this means is consent to do one thing does not mean that there is suddenly consent for a bunch of other stuff to happen. Just because you have said yes to A doesn't mean that you're okay with B. And just because you've said yes to A now doesn't obligate you to say yes to A in the future. I think the best way to talk about this from a kink perspective is to think about opt-in versus opt-out negotiation styles. With opt-in negotiation, only the things that you actively say yes to are okay. Whereas with opt-out negotiation, everything is fine except for the things that you say no to. And I think specificity is a really important part of having a good negotiation practice, because if somebody just says, yeah, beat me up please, let's go have fun, unless you've negotiated for like a consensual non-consent dynamic, or it's somebody that you know super well where you know exactly all of their buttons to push, that's not really a lot of information to work with. And it also shouldn't be taken that because somebody says yes to a paddle, they say yes to this cane. Or because they say yes to DDLG, they're also saying yes to pet play, right? Being really narrow in what you consent to, being specific with it, I think is a great thing to practice and a great thing to keep in mind. And something else I really like with specificity is it's not just about saying yes to A or B, but also when is it okay to do this particular thing. You might say, yes, please call me a dirty slut during this scene or while we're having sex. That is specific to whatever moment you've negotiated for. Not call me a dirty slut during my big work meeting. Not call me a dirty slut in front of my parents. Not call me a dirty slut in casual conversation or as a serious insult, right? So I think thinking about that specificity is really important. Again, unless you've negotiated otherwise. And just to remind everyone, again, the Fry's model is a best practice model. It is not saying that this is how all consent should look under all circumstances all the time with everyone. It's more meant to be a guidepost for this is going to lead to the best possible outcome if you keep all of these steps in mind. Obviously, if you negotiate differently, if you have a higher risk tolerance, if it's a partner you know really well that you've been with for years, then yeah, your consent framework might look differently from this, and that's totally okay. Again, it's meant to be used as a guidepost, a reference point of things that you should keep in mind when you are evaluating how you give and receive consent in a robust manner. Like I said, I think we're going to have some further conversations related to some kink ethical frameworks, so make sure you subscribe if you want to see that, as well as other kink and BDSM related videos. If you do have any comments or questions for me, you can put that down in the comment section below. If you already support my channel, if you're already subscribed, I do recommend you go ahead and check out my Patreon. That has a bunch of additional resources, photo shoots, extra videos, things that I can't necessarily show here on YouTube, so please check that out if you haven't already. If you do already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you guys next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.